I wrote about 10 icons of evolution in my book. I could have written about more, but I had to stop somewhere. And the 10 that I wrote about were, first of all, the 1953 Miller-Urey experiment that purported to show that life could have begun spontaneously on the early Earth. And this is still found in most biology textbooks, even though geochemists decades ago decided that the experiment was unrealistic and really doesn't say anything substantial about the origin of life. The second icon was Darwin's tree of life, the branching pattern that would show how all organisms descended from a common ancestor at the root. And this is a theoretical statement, but it's presented in most biology textbooks as though it were a fact. The fossil evidence, for example, does not show this branching tree pattern. When you look at the different major groups of animals, they appear pretty much at the same time, rather than diverging from a common ancestor. The third icon I wrote about was homology in vertebrate limbs. If you look at the bone structure of the human hand or the human arm, you compare that to a whale's flipper or a bird's wing or a bat's wing. There are certain striking similarities in the bone structure. And Darwin considered this to be a result of common descent. But people before Darwin had noticed the same thing, and they attributed it to a common designer. Well, the truth is, it could be either one. The bone structure itself doesn't tell us. The fourth icon is Haeckel's embryo drawings, which purport to show that vertebrates are very similar as early embryos, and therefore this provides evidence for common ancestry. But in fact, the embryos are not similar, and Haeckel faked the drawings. The fifth icon that I wrote about was Archaeopteryx, a famous fossil of an ancient bird that had a long tail and teeth in its beak like reptiles, and for a long time was thought to be the missing link between reptiles and birds. Biologists no longer think that because there are too many differences between Archaeopteryx and modern birds, but textbooks tend to present it as the missing link anyway. The peppered moth is a famous icon of evolution in which moths supposedly changed color during the Industrial Revolution because dark moths were better camouflaged on soot-darkened tree trunks, and the birds couldn't see them, and so they ate the light moths and left the dark ones. And this is still used in many textbooks as a classic example of natural selection in action, when in fact biologists discovered in the 1980s that peppered moths don't rest on tree trunks in the wild at all, or normally. And so the textbook pictures have all been staged, and the story has serious flaws. Darwin's finches, another icon of evolution, are some species of birds on the Galapagos Islands that are very similar except for the size and shape of their beaks. And it's thought, and it's quite possible, that they evolved from a common ancestor because of having to eat different foods on the different islands. But the actual evidence shows us only that the beaks can change over a matter of years based on climate and diet. But the changes are temporary, they oscillate back and forth, and they don't go anywhere. So as evidence for the origin of species, Darwin's finches really don't work. Another icon of evolution is the four-winged fruit fly. Most fruit flies have two wings, but a series of mutations in a fruit fly can cause it to develop a second set of wings, very normal looking, but in fact there are no muscles attached to it, so the second set of wings is effectively dead. The fly is a hopeless cripple. It's kind of like having a small plane with an extra pair of wings tied to its tail. This is not the forerunner of a new race of insects, but an evolutionary dead end. The last two icons I wrote about were fossil horses and the ape-to-human picture. In both cases, there is some real evidence here. The important point in both of these icons, I'll mention them together, is that a very heavy dose of philosophy is laid onto the evidence in each case, mainly to persuade students that evolution is without direction or purpose. In the case of the ape to human icon, students are also told that humans, in effect, are nothing more than animals. Neither one of those claims comes from the evidence. Both of those are philosophical claims, but they use the evidence to make themselves appear more scientific than they really are. And so that's my criticism of those two icons. I think the most important reason to question and criticize Darwinian evolution is to make science better. The issue here is how to do good science. By that I mean theory, evidence, checking one against the other, and being willing to abandon the theory when it doesn't fit the evidence. That to me is science. It's ultimately truth-seeking. Darwinism to me is ideology, indoctrination. It's theory at all costs.
There is usually an element of the truth in any false teaching, which is used to try to convince us that the whole teaching is true. Therefore, we need to think clearly and pay attention to be certain the conclusions are really supported by the evidence. The argument is not over the evidence, but their interpretation. The icons may be interesting, but they really have nothing to say about the real origins of man. The icon's continued and repeated use demonstrates the lack of real scientific evidence supporting evolution. As science has advanced to demonstrate that all living organisms are based on complex information systems requiring an intelligent agent, it's tragic so much time and money is being wasted trying to support an atheistic worldview based on an antiquated 1859 theory. Who is really stuck in the past? Then we will no longer be like children, forever changing our minds about what we believe because someone has told us something different, or because someone has cleverly lied to us and made the lie sound like the truth. Ephesians 4:14.